Okay, in this video, we're going to take a quick look at the idea of zero and undefined slope. I'm just going to give you some diagrams to look at and kind of help you understand when the slope is called zero and undefined. All right, so here is some diagrams of slope that we have looked at. Obviously, we've taken a look at positive slopes and negative slopes, which you should be familiar with at this point. When we have a line that is horizontal, we actually call that a zero slope. That's when the rise is zero, and regardless of what the run is, we end up with a horizontal line. We call it a zero slope. When the line is undefined, we end up with a run of zero. So the rise can be anything, but the run is zero. And that's when we call it an undefined slope. Again, here is just a diagram of zero slope, okay? And basically, we just have to remember when it is called zero or undefined. So I'm going to give you a way to help you remember that. Use this phrase, hoy, H-O-Y. We have a phrase called hoy vux, but we're going to start with hoy. Hoy, again, is the idea that the line is horizontal. Horizontal, that just means it's straight across left to right, okay? And it is a zero slope, all right? But technically, we call it zero, but the value is zero, but we call it zero. That's the O with the zero. And then the Y is going to stand for the equation, and we'll understand this in a second. But the equation for this would be y equals, the value, okay? Y equals, and I'll explain that in a second. But remember this hoy, okay? And then for undefined slope, we're going to remember vux. So we have hoy and then vux, V-U-X, okay? The V stands for vertical. And the U stands for the undefined. We call it undefined. I guess I wrote my U twice, but it stands for undefined. And the X is where the equation, again, is X equals a value, some value. All right. Here we go. Let's take a look at this one. This example says to determine the slope and write the equation of the following graph. Okay. So notice with this graph that we have this horizontal line. And you can see that it's down here on the y-axis at -3. Okay. So it's a horizontal line. When you see that it is a horizontal line, again, I want you to remember that phrase, hoy, okay? Hoy, horizontal line. So what we know then that the slope is zero. So we're gonna call that a zero slope. And the equation then, here is y, remember, that's where the -3, here's y at -3. That means the equation of this slope, all we have to put is that the equation is y equals -3. Because it doesn't matter what the x value is, we always go down to -3. So if you plug in a 1, you get a -3. If you plug in a 2 for x, you get a -3. If you plug in a 3, you get a -3. So you can see on this table here that we always have an output of -3. So the equation is very simple, y equals -3. This is a zero slope because the line is horizontal. All right, let's take. I also want to point out here when you are finding slope, like if you aren't looking at the graph, okay, and you're finding slope or you're finding the change in y over the change in x, and you end up with a 0 here for the change of y, and some number here, that this is when you have what's called a zero slope because the rise is 0. It doesn't matter what you get when you subtract the x values, but when you subtract y2 minus y1 and get 0, that's when you have a 0 slope. Look at one more example. This says to determine the slope and write the equation of the following graph. So in this graph, you see that it is vertical. So when you see a vertical graph and you're asked about the slope, maybe it would help to remember the phrase VUX or VUX. The line is vertical, so the slope we call undefined. So we'll simply write undefined slope. And then as far as the equation, you will see that the x value is always 3, okay? We always have a 3 where you see the x. So we could simply call this equation, we would write out as x equals 3. And again, if we had a table, you could see that the x is always 3 if we listed the points. So 3, 1, 3, 2, 3, 3, and we go all the way down to 3, negative 8, and so on, okay? I want to point also want to point out on this one, when you're finding the change in y over the change in x, and you get a number here for the change of y, but then you get 0 down here for the change in x, that's when we call this a undefined slope. And that's our quick look at 0 and undefined slope.